Sorry, I was unmuted. So I'm just starting again. Hello, everybody. I'm very excited to welcome you to our second webinar on pragmatic comparative effectiveness of randomized trials. It's about real-world evidence for better health and care decisions given by Frank Hulstaert from the Belgian Healthcare Knowledge Center. But before we start, I would like to give Cristina Nieto, our partnership coordinator, to give some introduction about the upcoming call of the net. Please, Cristina. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Shlomit, for the kind introduction. And thank you especially to Dr. Hulstaert for accepting our invitation and to provide the lecture today. We are glad to have this webinar, and hopefully it's of your interest and very useful, especially if you are potentially considering the participation in our future call dedicated to pragmatic comparative effectiveness trials. So I will just briefly introduce you the upcoming call. Can you see the slides?
Yes.
Just very briefly, our partnership fosters the European Collaborative Research Funding for our priority areas that are covered by our strategic research and innovation agenda, which include all these priority areas such as cardiovascular diseases, prevention and public health strategies, nutrition and lifestyle-related diseases, and nanotechnologies. And our consortium is conformed by 37 partners from 24 countries different. The aim of the future call that will be launched by our partnership, as you could see in the pre-announcement that is already published in our website, and this call will be launched next week by 20th November. We will have a dedicated info day on 27th November that we kindly request you to attend if you are considering the application. And the aim of this call is to support randomized, interventional, and pragmatic comparative effectiveness multi-country trials initiated by investigators. We encourage and enable transnational collaboration between clinical and public health research teams. The main requirements of this call that all proposals need to fulfill is to cover these pragmatic randomized interventional comparative effectiveness trials, compare the use of currently approved healthcare interventions either to each other or to the current standard of care, to include healthcare interventions at diagnostic, screening, prevention, or treatment interventions that can be pharmacological or non-pharmacological, such as nutrition or lifestyle procedures, surgery protocols, use of medical devices, e-health, etc. And include proposals that are focused only in the fields of these specific diseases, although potentially could include related comorbidities in cardiovascular diseases, metabolic disorders, nutrition and lifestyle-related diseases, or non-communicable respiratory diseases. The out of scope of this call are other medical diseases and also other types of clinical studies, such as phase 1 or phase 2 or observational studies. In the pre-announcement is really detailed, which is out of scope and which is the aim of the call, and also included further requirements and recommendations that needs to cover the proposals that will apply for this call. And here is just a summary of the countries that are participating in this call. I will not enter into detail. They are detailed in the pre-announcement as well as the expected timeline of this call. That's all. Thank you very much for your attention. And I didn't want it to extend more. I wanted to leave the floor to our doctor, to our invitee, to our speaker, the Dr. Frank Hulstaert. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cristina. Just a kind reminder for everybody to close their mic. And we will have 15 minutes of Q&A at the end of Frank's talk. Thank you.
So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the invitation. You can hear me well? Yes? Okay, thank you. So indeed, I want to present some slides about pragmatic comparative effectiveness randomized trials, and as a way, in fact, to generate real-world evidence. Just to position where I come from the Belgian health, the KCE, the Belgian Healthcare Knowledge Center, where we are also a HTA body, Health Technology Assessment, and that is linked also with the funding of pragmatic randomized clinical trials that was started more recently in 2016. So I come, as I mentioned, from the health technology assessment angle, which is advising healthcare payers to reimburse or not to reimburse a given new intervention. And that is very different from the technical innovator. And typically the technical innovations, they come in prime time on TV, and then the last sentence is that yes, it might still take another 10 years before this innovation will reach the patient. So HTA is really about routine practice, the added therapeutic benefit, and I will come back to that because it's always comparative, and about value for money. And so this evidence gap needs to be covered with the clinical development. Comparative effectiveness is always comparing, and so two treatment options that are in use. And the question is, which of the two is then best for the patient in daily practice? And it includes not only pharmaceuticals, not only medical devices, but all types of interventions. Just to put into context, before an innovation can reach the patient, there is two pillars, or some will call it hurdles, before this innovation can reach the patient. And this is given here for medicinal products and medical devices. On one hand, there is the regulatory pathway. On the other hand, there is the healthcare payer. And from a regulatory point of view, this is now all at European level. The HTA payer evaluation used to be at national or even regional level. And starting next year, it will also start at European level. The regulatory pathway is focusing on a benefit risk assessment, whereas the HTA is always comparative and comparing the therapeutic benefit versus what is available already. And again, focusing also on the value for money. Now in the middle, you see that some of the elements have created some tensions between regulators and payers, like expedited pathways, surrogates, misuse of single-arm trials, and then a question mark about real-world data. A lot is actually changing for the moment in Europe with regard to the legislations. There is the new device regulation coming into place, but already at the European Parliament there is discussion about it. The pharmaceutical framework is being revised, and there is the new HTA regulation, as I mentioned, that will come into place early next year. And of course, there is also the ethical framework, the Declaration of Helsinki, where ethics committees and competent authorities are checking whether this declaration is respected in terms of active comparator and transparency, also and the registration of the trial and publication of the data. Coming back to the HTA European regulation, two concepts at the top. The joint clinical assessment is something new, will start early next year. And it will be looking at a set of relevant PICOs that the countries have proposed. And there is also the possibility to have a joint scientific consultation before the confirmatory trials in development start. And the focus of the HTA regulation will start with oncology and ATMPs, but it will be followed by also some of the devices, for example. So that's a new evolution that's coming soon. And there is already some guidance on the quantitative evidence synthesis. And there are chapters on randomized trials, but also on single-arm trials and indirect comparisons. And you can see the link there. And I will come back to some of the sections. For example, for indirect comparisons, it's very much preferred to have anchored indirect comparisons. And single-arm trials, as mentioned already, it causes some problems for comparative effectiveness, because indeed that does not seem to be very much fit for purpose. And so at the bottom you read, it may well be that this evidence is insufficient for estimation of the relative treatment effectiveness in the context of the joint clinical assessment. So what is the problem? You see here first drug compared with placebo, and then somewhat later a new drug also compared with placebo. But in fact, what we want to know is whether the new drug 2 is better than the existing drug 1. In a direct comparison is much more robust compared with an indirect comparison. And so that is what this comparative efficacy in that case, but often one has to do evaluation of effectiveness based on efficacy data, unfortunately, because, and we will come back to the level of pragmatism in the trials. Also, clinicians have been asking for more comparative data, and this is here an example of the field of severe asthma, where for the new drugs, and there is multiple of these new drugs, never have been compared head-to-head in the past. So this was a call for such comparative trials. And this is an illustration here when you do not have a placebo-controlled trial, but you have a single-arm trial, then it's very difficult to know where you are, whether you're better than a placebo, and whether you're better than what is the standard care. So that's a real challenge. Now, in some situations, single-arm trials are appropriate. For example, if you have a parachute, you do not want this parachute to be tested with a randomized controlled trial. When the treatment effect size is thus large, and then a single arm trial will do. But unfortunately, in medicine, we are more in the gray zone. The treatment effects are not always that clear. So there you need to have the most robust technique, and randomization is robust because it balances also for the unknowns. And you cannot correct for these unknowns when you do not have randomization. And of course, it also depends on the target population. And for ultra-rare diseases, it's very difficult indeed to, unless your treatment effect size is very large, to make any conclusions about an intervention. So to summarize these difficulties with single-arm trials in drug development is that they do not generate evidence for comparative effectiveness. And the suggested ways to overcome the problem is the use of external control arms, including data from routine practice or from other clinical trials. That would be better even. But often, at least the data from routine practice, the variables are not available in sufficient quantity or quality. And the post-licensing evidence generation has its own problem with often equipoise that is perceived to be lost, and then indeed shortcomings of observational studies remain the same. And all of this leads to a delay of evidence-based healthcare. And here I also want to point out to the role of the ethics review, and also they should look to the study designs and be more critical sometimes. Further on this, the concept of real-world evidence, there seems to be some discrepancy between definitions used in the US and Europe. FDA, in fact, includes the randomized trials, the large simple trials, the pragmatic trials, as a possible source of real-world evidence, which is not that clear because there is no clear definition from the European Medicines Agency yet. And what is the problem with the single-arm trials? That sometimes it is used more as a choice by a company rather than a necessity. The reasons when it is a necessity to use a single-arm trial, I've given the example, but often it's used more broadly. So that is a point of discussion. And why is, again, here an example, why is randomization important? These are from the cardiovascular device field. Some examples were observational studies with propensity score adjusted analysis, for example, gave different conclusions compared to the randomized controlled trials. And here I want to focus, in fact, on the taste and the total large randomized clinical trial. Why? Because this taste trial is, in fact, a registry-based randomized trial conducted in Sweden. And this is a slide from Jonas Aldgren from Uppsala, who presented at our trial symposium in 2017, showing also that the total cost of running such a large randomized clinical trial, if it can be conducted within a registry, is a lot less compared with the traditional randomized controlled trial. And furthermore, you have, and they had like 70% of the patients in the registry, they accepted to be randomized. They had a long follow-up and also a rapid recruitment. So a lot of advantages, I would say, of running a registry-based randomized trial. And here you see so you have both the advantages of the randomized controlled trials and the registry in terms of long-term follow-up, for example, the real-world population. So it's a nice combination. Of course, the condition is that you need a high-quality clinical registry, and it took the Swedes like 10 years to set up this high-quality registry in the field of cardiovascular diseases. So that's, of course, also a cost that needs to be taken into account. But once you have it, then you can use it. And the same is true for trials within cohorts and the so-called TWICs. So, for example, in the Swedish study, the only additional item to be asked to the patient, in fact, in addition to the existing registry, was, is there a consent of the patient and are the inclusion and exclusion criteria met for this trial? So that's very simple. Another way to run large simple trials, and this is the example here of the Oxford team on who successfully ran the recovery trial, for example, during COVID as a platform trial, where in fact all the variables could be summarized on a single sheet, a single page, and all the other variables were kind of linked into the database from existing data sources. So that's indeed also a very effective and cheap way to run very large clinical trials. And we have tried to do something similar at KCE to link the data from short follow-up randomized trial, and this was here for prevention of pressure ulcers with these silicone foam dressings. But for the longer follow-up, we actually, based on the national number, and of course this requires a plan and an authorization well before you start the trial, but it could be linked to the hospital administrative data, and the full length of stay, for example, of each patient could easily be calculated. And so healthcare payers, what is essential for them in the trial, that the full target patient population is included. So broad eligibility so that planned subgroup analysis can be conducted. That the intervention is as much as possible respecting the routine as will be used later on in practice. And that the comparator is standard of care, and a placebo can be used when appropriate, of course. And here I also mentioned that dose and duration finding can be additional arms, because often this tends to be forgotten, like for immunotherapy in oncology, one does not know how long should it be given. So that's something clearly that should not be tested post-market, but preferably pre-market if possible. And the outcomes, that's also critical. So anything that has to do with quality of life or overall survival function is critical for healthcare payers. And that's different from the more explanatory clinical trials, as we will come back on that. Quality of life is also a key variable, and the tool, the generic utility tool, the questionnaire, the EQ5D5L, is now more sensitive to change and can be used in a randomized clinical trial to see over time, when measured quite frequently, the difference between the old and the new health technology. I mentioned pragmatism as one of the key elements of an informative clinical trial, and that's also here in this publication the case. So what is a pragmatic trial? Is, according to one definition, to help choose between care options, and according to another definition, more focusing on effectiveness rather than efficacy. Now, of course, that's also very theoretical, because it's more of a gradation. So pragmatic, in the purest way, you want to have representative participants, interventions slotted into usual care, flexibility in delivery and adherence, so as in routine care, also the follow-up, and critical, of course, the primary outcome needs to be an outcome that is relevant for the participants and the patients. And that's in contrast to what we call an explanatory trial. And that's also a slide from Sandra Eldridge, also given at our trial symposium. The Précis tool can be used to assess the level of pragmatism for different axes, including recruitment, organization, flexibility in delivery and in adherence, the primary outcome. So the variables you have seen. So it's rather a continuum. So as mentioned here, it's more of an attitude to trial design, and so you try to make it as pragmatic as possible. But it's definitely not a synonym for sloppy. That should also be taken into account. The primary outcome should be the outcome that is most influential for making the clinical decision, and the follow-up should be long enough. And it should be well defined, the primary outcome, be patient relevant, and therefore it's important to involve patients right from the study design so they can also have their say in the outcome definition. It's very nice to see that pharmaceutical industry here, FPA, also supports the concept of pragmatic trials, randomized pragmatic trials, also as a source to generate real-world evidence and support for regulatory decisions. So that's more recent. It's from 2023, but I think it's important. So how can we see this evolution moving from a single arm, the phase 2A and the phase 2B3, the more explanatory, confirmatory, randomized clinical trials? We can see it moving to more platform or registry-based, explanatory, moving to more as much pragmatism as possible, confirmatory, randomized trials, so to be also informative for the payer decision. And in fact, this has already been published, such an adaptive, flexible design where you start off with your classical phase 2, phase 3 randomized clinical trial. But generally, when you do an interim analysis and you see from a safety point of view, for example, this looks to be good, and you can broaden the population, so then you move more towards more real-world conditions, but still randomized, so a more representative patient population, for example. What would be the advantage? Because if we look to the current situation where based on benefit risk analysis, a lot of questions still remain to be solved in the post-market phase with comparative effectiveness randomized trials, where sometimes there is a delay, the funding is not there, the recruitment is slow, so that all leads to a bit of a delayed evidence-based medicine for patients. And it could be faster if what can be done pre-market is actually done in the pre-market phase as much as possible. And that is on at the bottom, as you see. So when possible, I suggest with support from government, with support from HTA bodies, from the payers, eventually co-financing of some trial infrastructure, and it can be registries, for example, that can be used for that purpose. And this is an example here from our colleagues from IQWiC in Germany, where, for example, this evolution of the introduction of CAR-Ts in specific forms of lymphoma could perhaps be more informative if an adaptive platform trial would have been used instead of all these single-arm trials. Now, by giving an example, so the KCE trials of as a public funder, it's actually a rather recent evolution. End of 2015, we got approval to set it up with support from the NIHR and a collaboration with the Dutch colleagues from ZonMW, with a smaller budget that is now 10 million euros per year, and a first call for proposals in 2016. But with a clear focus on the return on investment from a public payer perspective. So we set up practice-oriented, pragmatic, multi-center, randomized, comparative effectiveness trials, including a broad range of interventions. And there was also a branch for confirmatory drug repurposing trials. Both national as well as international trials could be funded. And already from the literature, we had seen that there is a number of key elements to be successful. As a funder, one is to do your homework in terms of selection of the right PICOs and the right topics, and use panels of experts as well as methodologists, statisticians in a trials board, and we use multiple cycles for review. Then a clinical trial unit to help the investigator with setting up a multi-center trial, which is not always that easy. Definitely, if it is international, it becomes quite a challenge. And then publication of the results in the New England is nice, but more important is that the guidelines are changed and that clinical practice is changed based on these clinical trials. And there we are in a lucky situation because at KCE, our board of directors is a representative for all the stakeholders in the Belgian healthcare field. So we have a good chance that also results of the trials will be implemented. What can be done as a funder to reduce the risk? Because a lot of the trials that are being funded are slower in recruitment compared to what is planned or do not recruit at all. So we have a lot of educational events, symposia, sponsor workshops, as mentioned, the multiple review cycles to make sure the trial is as good as, and the protocol is as good as can be. We work in a two-step process, and the costing and the payment is milestone and activity based, and the tool is publicly available. We do fund feasibility by a CRO that helps the sponsor to do that exercise. But even with the feasibility exercise, you're never sure that recruitment will be that fluent. And we also do an advance payment to actually develop the full study protocol, because already that is also an investment from the academic side, and it's needed for the second step of the selection process. So finally, when the protocol is not selected, yeah, it's an investment we did as a payer, in fact. And then once the trial is running, we have a close monitoring of the progress in a very transparent way. And there you see the link to the dashboard. And that has resulted now in this year that we have over 30,000 participants recruited in 41 ongoing trials, and 15 of these have been completed. And we have now 4 papers in the New England with results of such trials. But more important indeed that some have impact in clinical guidance. This is the link to the dashboard, where for every site you see in real time or nearly real time, it's once a week it's updated. You see the recruitment per site and per trial. This is an open call for the moment. It's the international call with the Netherlands together for comparative effectiveness studies. Now, working in an international way for more pragmatic comparative effectiveness trials, is it important? Yes, for recruitment and for speed, provided you have a streamlined trial selection and funding process, and that there is no delay in trial approval in some of the countries. Yes, if there is consensus on what is the comparator, the standard of care. Yes, for external validity, but the healthcare settings may differ. So a more pragmatic approach is to make the trial as pragmatic as appropriate in that setting, because it's not always the same setting. So you need to be, it will not work. For example, in the field of obstetrics, Belgium and the Netherlands have a different setting. And so there it's more difficult to run an international trial that is pragmatic. But also in COVID platform trials, we were involved. I think there is room for improvement in Europe to make them start up more in a faster way. And when HERA is actually working on that as we speak. So some examples here, we compared diet or medication in primary care patients with irritable bowel syndrome. So a randomized trial. So it's comparing diet or pharmaceuticals, so different types of interventions, but that seems to work well. Here it's continuous or intermittent beta-lactam antibiotics in critically ill patients with sepsis. So that is also more an international trial where we then participated for the Belgian part. And perhaps some advertisement to finish is a trial symposium again this year. We will be having the 28th of November here in Brussels with a focus on drug repurposing on long COVID. We funded some of the trials in that field, on reduction of low value care, and on secondary use of the health data, which in many countries now is becoming a hot topic. So I want to stop here and be very happy to answer the many questions you will have. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank, for a very informative and interesting webinar. Before we continue with the questions, I would like to mention that the recording will be uploaded to Era for Health website, and we will also send a survey after the webinar to just ask the audience what they would like to hear more webinars about, if they are interested in any other subjects, and so on. So you can raise your hand if you would like to ask questions in person, or just send it in the chat and we will ask those questions. Bert is asking, can you place the link to the symposium in the chat for now?
Okay, I will try to do that. Link for the KCE trials, and there you can find all the information. And I'll take the English version.
I see all the audience, so I'm just hoping if there anyone who would like to ask a question, you can write. Dra is asking, can you put the link of the offer for courses or other materials for that as well?
The courses that we organize, so the symposia are of course open to anyone. The courses we organize is mainly for the clinical trial units that we have in the major hospitals in Belgium, also for the investigators who want to check whether their idea can be answered with a comparative effectiveness trial, for example. And we educate also academic investigators into what it takes to run successfully a large multi-center clinical trial, because often they are not aware of all the difficulties and all the requirements that it takes, which is more than you think.
I would like to ask you about the pre-market phase, which you suggested there should be more trials or clinical trials before they launch into the market. However, it's very expensive, and it's very hard to get funding for even for POCs. So how do you suggest to fund the pre-market trials?
Yeah,
should be funded by the companies? Should be a partnership between? Should the public pay for that?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, setting up good quality registries, there I see a role for funders, for the governments, and definitely in Europe we would benefit if we would have like an international clinical registries for rare diseases, so that once these are established, one could use these registries to run also within these registries observational clinical studies, but also randomized clinical studies at a very low cost. So establishing these registries can have a cost and will have a cost. And there, I think there is a role for government. And then together with the regulators, there should be kind of a push to use these existing registries then also for the more registration trials by companies, so that it can go faster, recruitment can be faster, will be cheaper for companies too, to have more options available, and definitely for rare diseases where it is very difficult nowadays to set up such trials. It could also make Europe more attractive for the pharmaceutical industry. I think it's a win-win situation, I guess. But yeah, it still takes some time to get there, and it needs collaboration from multiple sides: regulatory side, government side, public funding side, and it could also be used like platform trials in other areas. So the combination of existing registries or cohorts with then the concept of platform trials, and also this idea of moving towards more pragmatism over time, when you run first your well-controlled phase 2 or phase 3 trial, but you gradually do an interim analysis, and then you can expand into a more broad patient population. I think to answer some of the questions from the HTA bodies and the healthcare payers, that could also be attractive. So I call for more research into more efficient design options for clinical trials. Instead of looking only to the use of the real world data from administrative sources, where you be frustrated with the quality of the data that you find there. There is more efficient ways to do randomized research, I think. Yeah.
So there's a question from Lindsay. She's asking, please share your thoughts on the risk associated with pragmatic trials compared to RCTs.
If you look to patient risks, in theory, they are much lower, because indeed your pragmatic trial should be run when you have passed the safety check, but of course you cannot make a phase 1 or a phase 2 and turn it into a pragmatic trial. No, you need to start with the explanatory clinical trial and then expand, as I explained. When your safety checks are okay, then you can include a more broad patient population, which will be exposed to the drug or intervention anyhow in routine care. Because what we are facing now often is that a large part of the patient population that is using the new intervention in routine care was never tested in the clinical trials because they were excluded because of the eligibility criteria. And that should be changed probably, and make it more pragmatic would be a good evolution, but at the right time, I mean. So not start your phase 1 as a pragmatic trial. That's not a good idea.
Not at all. Okay, anybody? Any more questions? Yes, from Claudia. Do you have any hints for trials on off-label use of pharmaceuticals?
Well, that's part can be repurposing in another indication. That's also the type of trials that we fund. Actually, we have like on Diamox, which is an old diuretic. We had a trial where it proved to be of help for patients also when they had overload and entered on intensive care or be hospitalized, patients with chronic heart failure or acute heart failure. And we have another repurposing trial ongoing with the use of an old diabetic drug, metformin, to control the degradation of the kidney function in non-diabetic patients. So that's a clear repurposing. We have another one with colchicine in cardiovascular secondary prevention. So that that is indeed off-label use of existing medicines, cheap medicines often that are off patent, but might be of use. And there is a European project also on that. There is this, what is called, I have the repurposing of medicines for all, the remedy for all project that is focusing on repurposing to answer that.
Okay, another question from Bert is if the care is mainly provided by GPs, what could be an effective way of including GPs in pragmatic trials, especially when you want to conduct a large multi-center clinical trial?
Yes, including GPs into clinical trials. Not only during COVID, it was a challenge, but also in other clinical trials, it's not that easy because they do not, in contrast to hospital setting, there is no study nurses unless you go for group practices that are large enough where they have this kind of support to help you run the clinical trial. So another design I did not mention, but which is also very pragmatic, but you need a good statistician to help you out with that one, is the cluster randomized clinical trial, where there is actually less intervention because you're allocated as a group or as a center one of the two treatment options. So that's also an option to be checked for GP trials, which we have used in the past also. That worked out quite nicely, but you need a good statistician to do all the power calculation. Yeah.
Question from Arvid: will EMA approve a new indication for a drug if we do not include a placebo arm when we do not have any established treatment today?
Yeah, that's indeed a good question, because indeed, and even with the established treatments we have today, some date from a time when there were kind of accepted treatments without a lot of evidence supporting it. So even there you could ask, do we still need to check it with the placebo whether there is a real effect? Yes, so there is definitely room for placebo to add a placebo on top of the standard of care to also, depending on the endpoint, whether there is more a subjective or a more objective endpoint. Like if you go for mortality, we often run trials in a pragmatic way, and then is quite a hard endpoint, I would say. So that depends on the endpoint also.
Thank you. For those who's asking about specific questions about future calls or the current call of Air for Health, you can find information in our website, so it's not directly to Frank.
But if I may, that is indeed a very interesting call that is being launched for, I think, for Europe to fund such trials is great to see it being launched. I think there will be a learning curve also, which we have also experienced at the start. But it's very good to see this movement, and also in pandemic preparedness and this HERA subgroup, where I'm involved in these platform trials, will be worm-based clinical trials. So they will be running also and will be set up from the start as platform trials, which will be also interesting to see when there is no pandemic, to see how new options of treatment can be added to such platform trials. Yeah.
Right. And maybe one more question from my side. Maybe it's a side question, I suppose. Do you suggest to add a clinical trial program or studies in med schools in science department as part of the education of physicians and researchers.
Yes, perhaps limited for everyone, but definitely as a kind of for those interested to be a combination of clinician and researcher. It would help very much so that they know what are the advantages of making use of, for example, a clinical trial unit where they have expertise in data management and statistics and study monitoring. Because nowadays this is seen often as actually a cost and a hurdle in hospitals because they have to pay for these services and yeah, for a single center trial in their hospital, they might try to do everything with some support locally from their department. But once you move to larger multi-center trials, this becomes impossible. So you need support. And so that is an important message to bring already indeed in the education of physicians and other health professionals indeed.
Yeah, better preparation even in the preclinical stages for the stages to come.
But that is then more on a more full product development scheme. Actually, we will come out with a report on academic ATMP development after New Year at KCE, where we have also seen that it's very difficult for academia to move forward with clinical trials to a more advanced stage, and where it's also sometimes they have to redo their non-clinical work to be in compliant with the full GMP and yeah. So that's a whole and indeed the full development is very different from, and it's a field that clinicians are not aware about. That's correct. Yeah. Most are not.
So thank you very much. It seems like there are no more questions. A reminder that the recording will be uploaded to the Earth for Health website. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Dr. Frank.
Bye-bye.